Glenn, can you see the slide deck?
I can see the slide deck.
Perfect. Thank you all again for attending today on our workshop looking at elements of program deliverability as part of our statewide energy assistance program study. We work here at the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce covers a great many deal of programs and different policy areas from energy to infrastructure and broadband, community services and facilities, and so much more. The common theme uniting these programs and policies is an effort to strengthen communities across our state. I wanted to give a little bit of background on what brings us here today and what we'll be discussing. So in 2019, the state legislature passed the Clean Energy Transformation Act that set Washington on a path to a clean, affordable, reliable, and equitable clean energy future. As part of that law, under RCW 19405-120, what we'll refer to as Section 120, utilities are instructed to make progress on providing energy assistance to low-income households. As part of that statute, the utilities must report data and submit assessments of their programs to Commerce. And when I use the term utilities here, I mean electric utilities in the state. As part of that statute, Commerce collects those reports, does some data collection itself as required by the statute, and pulls that into a report to the legislature. The legislature requires Commerce to evaluate additional mechanisms of assistance, including system benefits charges. And the idea behind the system benefits charge is that you would place a charge across utilities. Those funds would then go to a statewide energy assistance program for households. As part of that report, we also found that utility programs statewide serve only a small percentage of low-income households compared to statewide programs such as Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, or commonly known as food stamps, which has a similar eligibility standards. So this led us to explore a statewide approach as part of our process in that report. And I think the key thing here was that by looking at that statewide approach and seeing how we could be connected better into statewide programs that are providing assistance, we could increase program participation in the state, improve targeting assistance, reduce admin costs, among other things. The state, when our report was issued back in March, and the state requested us, legislature, I should say, requested us to look at that statewide approach in further detail and look at developing recommendations on the design for a statewide energy assistance program. As Michael said, that's not a recommendation for a statewide program. It is simply to look further into this idea, a couple of aspects of it, which we'll discuss in a moment, to see how a program would work and what the opportunities and limitations are there. So the initial deadline for our study looking at this was January 1, 2024. We expect to publish the report in June of 2024 to make sure we have adequate time to do an analysis. And the legislature here asked us to look at a number of areas for us to consider when thinking about the design of a statewide program. The ones that I want to call your attention to today, one is the bottom here, a funding aspect. How would the program be funded and how would that impact program design? And another part here that's embedded in this work but not explicitly stated is the mechanism for bill assistance. So whether that would be a flat amount on a customer's bill, or whether it would be a tiered discount based on income for households, among other options. And those are the two things we'll be considering today: the type of mechanism and how funding impacts program design. So that leads me to my next topic. So our objectives, more explicitly, are to identify benefits, drawbacks, and other considerations for how different monthly bill assistance and funding mechanisms would impact the deliverability of assistance to low-income households. So I'm going to stop there, and then we're going to transition over to the bill mechanism piece. And Glenn, I think you are up first, and I'd invite you to add any additional context for this discussion. We're jumping in.
Yep, that sounds good, Austin. Thanks. And so what we're going to do in this next section is look at some of the alternatives that have been identified to pay for a statewide monthly bill assistance benefit if the legislature were to authorize a program of that sort. And we're going to look at these with some criteria in mind. Not that we've exactly defined what those criteria are, but just generally, we want to look at how effective they would be in, producing the outcome that we want in terms of reducing energy burden and targeting the reductions to those with the greatest burden to the extent that's possible to do. But that would be the ideal in a way. And then to try to have an equitable contribution to the program from different entities across the state, whether that's ratepayers, taxpayers, utilities, others. But so we're going to try to break that into some different pieces and work through those and get your feedback on these different amounts. So the first one that we're going to do is really simplified, and maybe it's as much an illustration of how we want to try to talk about it than it really being a viable approach. So let's look at the first one, which is a monthly flat amount. So the idea here would be that we identify the customers who are eligible based on their income. So we have, we've qualified the people to receive a benefit, which would be in the form of bill assistance on their regular utility bill. And in this example, it would just be a flat amount, like everybody would get the same thing. Let's say it's $50 a month of energy assistance, a credit that would show up on their bill if they have been determined to be eligible based on income. So looking at that, it seems like it would, there's a lot of things we wouldn't need to know about. We wouldn't need to find out, what their actual energy costs are. We wouldn't need to know what their income is beyond the fact that they meet the definition of low income. We would just be providing the same amount every month, every customer, regardless of any other details of their situation. So that's the benefit, is not much information is required to provide that type of benefit. And then the drawbacks that we've seen in that would be that it doesn't vary the amount based on how much energy it takes to provide that household with their, to meet their energy requirements. It's not adjusted for, the different weather, situations in different parts of the state, or even just, from month to month, the variations in energy costs. It also wouldn't target the benefit more to people who are very low income compared to people who are low income but come closer to reaching that threshold where they wouldn't be considered low income anymore. And then kind of the combination of those two would be that it doesn't specifically address the energy burden, where someone who maybe is paying 6.1% of their income for energy costs, they would get the same benefit as someone who's paying 16% of their income for their energy costs. And then, so that would be the general benefits and drawbacks of an approach where you use a flat monthly amount. And I see Lisa's comment that it doesn't promote conservation. I think that's a really good observation to make. Is it doesn't? It seems like to me it might be neutral on that. The customers would benefit. They would reduce their monthly, per consumption amount that they pay, because they get that amount, like the $50 I was talking about, every month, whether they increased or decreased their energy consumption. But it doesn't have any specific incentive to improve efficiency in that approach. Austin, do you want to have us go through the different ones here? This one, like I said before, is a little bit of a, illustrating the concept, because it is so simplified that, I think there's some important things to discuss about the others as we try to get more targeted, but then that will also make it more complicated. But so do you think the best approach is to go to the next one and talk about it and let people continue to offer comments in the chat as we do that?
Yeah, I would appreciate if folks threw comments in the chat on this particular one. It is informative, and it for thinking about approaches that use a monthly flat amount, even if it or just a flat amount of benefits, for thinking about that. So please put your comments in the chat. We are relying on a slide deck today, which we haven't done much in this workshop series. And we're continuing to collect comments in the chat. And as you might have seen, if you joined early, we've got James Vogel here, who's leading our note-taking work. In the past few workshops, we've had James take notes, and you could see him take notes as you go. He is still taking notes, and we will still publish those notes with the comments in the chat. So your comments in the chat are very much appreciated. And we will be posting those comments along with James's notes on any verbal feedback we receive as we go through this workshop, and those will be available on our Energy Assistance webpage when we're done. So let's scoot over the next one, and if anyone has any more comments on the monthly flat amount, please feel free to do that. I think I was going to discuss this one, Glenn. We can go back and forth.
I think that's right.
So this is the monthly percentage discount. This percentage discount would be applied monthly to household bills, and it would be linked to energy usage. So more they would use, but it is not linked to income, and it is not energy burden specific. So we would not be factoring in the household income aside from deeming them eligible for a program. and we would not be doing any sort of calculation to determine energy burden and make the discount or amount of assistance based on the household energy burden. It does have little information required to access this program. You would need some energy usage information in the total bill, but that is it for this particular discount. I don't
And
know,
also,
Glenn, is there anything else you'd like to add?
well, I think one thing to clarify based on the comments is that the percentage wouldn't change based on income, but there would still be an eligibility determination. So if someone isn't eligible based on their income, then they wouldn't receive a discount at all. But then anyone who's eligible would receive a discount, and it would be the same discount regardless of any other characteristic that they have. So if they were, a very low income customer, they would get the same percentage discount as a customer who's low income, but much closer to the threshold.
Thanks, Glenn, for catching that in the chat. Clarification. Does anyone have any questions about this one? How it would be implemented, the program design implications of this? Feel free to raise your hand or put comments in the chat. Nicholas.
Good afternoon. Yes, you can see me. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Just a quick question. With regard to the monthly percentage bill discount, would you assume that that would be calculated by utilities, or would that be prepared by some centralized entity? Just administratively, how would you assume that that would work?
Good question. I've been thinking about this as a discount that is set statewide. It's a percentage that would be set, and then the bill information would probably need to flow to the state entity, and then the funding would flow back to the utility and be applied to the customer account. Steve.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely echo the comments in the chat. Concerned about how this is applied in terms of disincentivizing conservation, and also concerned about without the right parameters in place. And I appreciate, Glenn, your comments on eligibility. If we don't have the right eligibility structure in place, then this program can, in terms of the kind of the runaway funding needed to support it, it would accelerate fairly rapidly. And again, want to make sure that we're actually reducing energy burden for those that are eligible. I like the focus on the folks that are most in need, but want to make sure that there's accountability involved here, without, again, disincentivizing conservation efforts, so we can keep control of energy usage.
Thanks, Steve, for your comments. I'm having a hard time tracking on my screen both the presentation and the hands in the chat. So feel free, Glenn, to raise any of those, and appreciate that folks continue to put stuff in the chat as well.
Yeah, there's no hands up right now, but we are getting some good comments in the meeting chat. So thanks everybody who's doing that.
All right, well, maybe. Oh, sorry.
I think we could go to the next one, and
yeah.
So I'll do this one, and it's, as you'll see, we're layering on here more, more elements to try to target the benefit, and but of course, in doing that, we're adding to some of the complication of actually administering it. So this version, it's still a percentage discount. It still has an income test to it. You know, you don't get any benefit if you're not low income, but within the group of people who are determined to be eligible based on income, the percentage discount could be greater for those who have lower income. So someone who you know is in the, you know, maybe they're in the very lowest level of income compared to other low income customers, they might get a big discount, you know, say an 80% discount. Where someone who's low income but not too far away from that threshold, they might get a smaller discount, like let's say 20%. And it, you know, it could be tiered in that way based on income. So if we had a structure like that, then one benefit that we see to that approach would be that those who have the lowest income would receive the greatest benefit. A drawback would be that it still doesn't directly address energy burden. You could have you know, two households that are both, say, at the 50% mark, you know, in terms of right in the middle among low-income customers, but one household might have a bigger energy burden for a variety of different factors, and they would get the same percentage discount as another household who has the same income, but their energy bill isn't as great. Now, since it's a percentage, the amount of the benefit could be, you know, would be greater for those who are spending more on their energy, but it doesn't directly address energy burden in this setup. And then other considerations that we thought about in developing this, you know, one is the effort that would be required to determine those tiers and to maintain that information over time. You know, that we would need to have procedures established about, you know, how often the amounts are adjusted based on an individual household's income. That could change quite a bit, you know, from one month to the next. And, you know, exactly how you would track that over time, it could be complicated to do that. I think just in general, this would be, you know, would have more administrative burden to it than some of the other structures that we've described before of managing these percentage amounts over time for each household based on their own income characteristics. Let me take a quick look at the chat and see how well I did at explaining that one. So I see Thor's question about whether this is really a discount. And for me at least, the term makes sense, because what I think of is that, you know, say if the customer is paying 10 cents a kilowatt hour for their electricity, then if they get a 80% discount, then they wouldn't pay 10 cents per kilowatt hour, they would pay 2 cents per kilowatt hour. The utility would adjust the bill so that the customer receives a bill based on that discounted rate. And then the funding for the other 80% would come from a funding mechanism that we'll discuss here in a few minutes. So that's what we think of it as a discount. It's not that they pay the full amount and then receive a check in the mail for the to offset a portion of that, that it would actually be reflected in the first bill that they received from their utility. I also see some questions about like whether this would apply to all the utilities and how it might work with existing utility programs. And I see that as a question for the legislature. What we've been directed to do is to scope out at the conceptual level, statewide program that if the legislature decided it wanted to implement that, then it could also decide whether it wanted to do that as a complete replacement for utility specific programs, or if they wanted it to operate in some way as a supplemental program. And so what we're trying to do now is discuss that concept of it being the statewide program and how it might operate, and really not envisioning trying to scope this out as in some way working as an additional layer in terms of the existing utility specific programs. But again, it would really be up to the legislature to make that decision.
I think you got a few hands raised, Glenn.
Look at that, I do. Shall we go with Carol, then we'll do Nicholas?
Hello. Yeah, I was just thinking, right now with the utility discount programs or any of the programs, it's for a lot of us, it's a voucherless system, right? So it's accounted for and taken out of the total that's available, but the money doesn't go back and forth. So every month, if it's a percentage, it's going to be, it'll change every month, and then a new payment will have to be made every month. So you're not touching that file once, you're touching that file every month, which really makes a lot more administrative burden.
Okay, thank you, Carol.
Okay, so I'm assuming I'm next.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm just curious more than anything else on this one. One of the things that your report of a few months ago said is that a significant amount of the burden occurs because of non-electricity issues. And I understand that this says that it's not energy burden specific, but could you imagine a situation where the discount would essentially be 100% because of the amount that someone is spending on, I don't know, propane or wood or fuel oil or something along those lines?
I have a good imagination, and so yes, I can imagine that, even if it's not that, if it doesn't seem that realistic. To me, the easier one to think about is where you've got a customer that's getting their energy services from more than one utility, but both of those utilities or all of those utilities are participating in the same statewide program. So like if they have gas and electricity, then each of those utilities might provide this tiered discounted rate. And each of them individually then would be contributing to a reduction in the energy burden. Where it gets complicated, and that's where you went to, Nicholas, is if it's somebody who's not in the program, but we're somehow trying to account for that in the statewide program. So like propane, firewood, heating oil, we would either need to find some sort of mechanism for those fuels to also provide a discount and then have that discount funded through the statewide program. Or like you were saying, we would have to kind of like over discount the utility services, gas or electric, in order to make up for those other fuels. And to me, that does seem very complicated to do that. And yet, I do think we still need to be aware of that some of this energy burden does come from those other fuels. And if we are only addressing the part that's provided through utilities, then we could very well end up missing some households that have significant energy burden.
Thank you.
Lisa?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Lisa.
Austin? Oh, Erglin. Okay. Maybe I missed something, because when I think about what we're trying to accomplish, would be that we're trying to accomplish putting together a recommendation for how a state program would benefit or meet the CETA requirements, correct? I mean, is that what it's, or are we trying to come up with a statewide program that is not related to CETA? Because I kind of feel like we're a little bit off, in my opinion, if we're talking about all these other resources. I don't know. I'm trying not to overthink it. I'm trying to be, try to give you some good feedback. But if we're looking at energy burden, or we're even looking at programs that don't address energy burden, or calculations that don't address energy burden, I feel like we're not. I thought what we were doing is working on something for CETA, not just an overall state program. I don't know. I'm a little confused. I might have missed a memo somewhere.
I think one of the challenges that we all have is that in CETA, in Section 120 of CETA, it calls for the state to address the energy burden of low-income households. It doesn't say the electricity energy burden, it says the energy burden. And yet it also says that electric utilities need to do that. And, we've definitely heard over the years in implementing this, the challenge that creates for the electric utilities to try to address the overall energy burden of households who are in their service area, but maybe getting their energy services from entities other than the electric utility. And we don't know exactly what prompted the legislative direction for us to do this study, but my sense is that one of the reasons for that they wanted to take a look at this concept of a statewide program is that it might help to address this mismatch in Section 120 between the energy burden coming from multiple fuel sources, and yet it's a requirement that's limited to electric utilities. That we might get away from that mismatch if the legislature created a statewide, energy-wide program. Does that help in terms of a memo?
Maybe. One of the things I maybe could offer up or have you think about considering is, a lot of times maybe there's just a way for the state to get data. I'm sure you have a lot more data available to you than each individual utilities, that gives kind of an overall kind of close enough, what percentage when a customer is on oil, when a customer is on wood, when a customer does do these different types of energy uses, natural gas, what percentage is electricity, you know, like just put out, I mean, at some point, someone's going to have to make a decision to say, well, when a person's using natural gas to heat their home, you know, they're 30% of their energy burden belongs on natural gas and 70% is the utility. And I mean, it becomes more of a math problem, I guess, than it does all these other things, because it is a little bit challenging to try to put this on electric utilities. And I see some stuff in the chat going, you know, about the electrification and fossil fuels. And I mean, there's just so many competing priorities wrapped up in this that it could be hard to peel it all back.
Those are good points. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Another Lisa?
Hi, Glenn. It's Lisa Rennie from Tacoma Power. Since we were talking a little bit about CETA, there's one thing I've been a bit confused by, and that's the definition for low-income assistance in CETA, which includes both monetary and energy conservation, weatherization, energy efficiency. And it seems like this process is looking just at the monetary side. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think that's right. Would you agree with that, Austin?
I think that's right. We've focused it here.
Okay, that's great. I, wasn't sure. It's kind of going both back and forth trying to answer your question. So that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I would say, Lisa, when we do go to talking to CETA, then we adopt the CETA definition. So
Yeah.
for our purposes here, we are a bill assistance. When we go back
Okay.
to section 120, it's that broader
Okay.
definition.
Yeah. Another little quirk of CETA. Okay. Thanks.
All right, let's move along. I've seen some other good comments in the chat. Keep them coming. So our last mechanism here is a personalized amount of assistance based on household energy burden. So here we would be determining the household energy burden based on all of the total costs, residential energy costs for the household. And then we would be applying amount of assistance based on that amount of burden. I think in the simplest form, you could imagine it being, if you're at 6%, if the program defines household energy burden as 6% of household income, a program using this sort of type could say, hey, we want to limit the amount of burden to 6%, so the amount that the household would receive would reduce them to 6% of their household income, so that they would, under that program's definition, no longer need energy assistance. But this can be difficult to do for a number of reasons, including figuring out what the costs are for the firewood and propane and other non-utility energy costs. It requires a fair amount of coordination on the data side, and then to administer those payments and assistance. So I'm going to stop there and see if anyone has any questions or comments on this approach. And how it, would impact delivery to citizens. Jeff.
Yeah, I think what I would say to this is, I think aspirationally, this is a really neat idea. I think from a practical standpoint, I'd be interested at maybe hearing more of kind of what the administrative steps Commerce would envision in how to implement a program like this. Because it seems like, not just from organizations, there'd be a lot more burden, but also just the coordination piece of the likely eligible customers. This could also be a really difficult thing to pursue.
Thanks, Jeff. Steve.
Yeah, thanks. So what is the overall size of the program that we're looking at here? Because basically, are we looking to eliminate the impact of energy costs, basically eliminate poverty for the energy sector here? And so we're basically saying anyone who is going to qualify will just get assistance above 6%, with their energy burden above 6% of their income, and that just gets eliminated. And so all you have to do is sign up. And I guess that gets to the point of why you have fairly stringent income eligibility requirements to obtain federal assistance, and again, just from an affordability standpoint overall, whether it's utility paying for it or taxpayers paying for it. Is this just kind of a microcosm of we're going to eliminate poverty in the state through this program as it pertains to the electric sector?
Thanks, Steve, for your question. I see this this mechanism here is being one that is a bill assistance program tailored to reducing energy burden specifically for the households. It could be aimed at reducing that burden to 6% or some other number out of total household income. But I think any of these mechanisms here are looking to provide assistance, and that has a number of benefits, but it's important to keep in mind that it's focused on the energy costs for these low-income households.
If I could just do a follow-on real quick. I mean, when we look at CETA and the goals that are involved here, it's to eliminate, or it's to demonstrate progress towards meeting 90% of energy assistance need by 2050. And that's looking at kind of each utility service area. So it's a goal to reach. So I think if you then start applying that specifically to each customer that signs up at a particular period of time, whether it's before 2050 or right up to 2050, you're really accelerating that overall goal. And so all this is more to the point of, are we able to find a mechanism here that can grow over time as we're demonstrating progress without setting hard and fast parameters on a customer by customer basis of, hey, if you have over 6% energy burden, we're gonna eliminate that straight out, versus looking at the holistic approach of what type of energy conservation measures could be taken to reduce that energy burden over time, as well as having a program kind of ramped up over a particular time to ensure we don't run into an affordability shock for utilities or state taxpayers.
Thanks, Steve, for your comments, and encourage folks to think about this work as being informed but separate from CETA, and an opportunity to look outside of the parameters of what's in the CETA statute, and look at a statewide energy assistance program, which would be quite different than the current utility approach. I don't know, Glenn, if you have anything to add to any of that conversation, or.
Well, Steve, I think you're right about the current law identifying a 2050 aspiration point for this, and the legislature may continue to be guided by that as they're thinking about this statewide approach. It's really up to them. I do think that we shouldn't that we should recognize that even if we are successful at limiting energy costs for households to 6% of their income, that may still present a difficult expense for some households. And we've definitely heard from some advocates that the 6% level is higher than it should be to support low-income households. We decided and adopted a rule that set the energy burden threshold at 6%, but we do continue to hear advocacy on that point, and I expect we will, as the legislature is considering this concept as well. So anyway, all good points that are worth discussion.
Thanks, Steve. Nicholas.
So others have said this in the chat, and Steve alluded to it, so I just going to say it real quick. I worry about this particular one in the sense that if you know that you're going to get your burden down to 6% no matter what you do, that would reduce the incentive for the household to engage in energy conservation. Obviously, they may not have money to spend on energy conservation. I recognize that fact, but their incentive would essentially go away to do anything to conserve electricity because their burden won't go any higher than 6%. So I would think, need to be some sort of mechanism to prevent people from misuse, whatever word you want to use to maintain the reasonable energy use. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nicholas. Jeff.
Yeah, so this is Jeff from PD. So I was trying to think of how to kind of articulate this, but I think a lot of us have kind of spoken around it. But this idea of why can't we propose, and I say you guys are doing the work, but we're here as program people kind of sharing what we know. But why can't we propose for a statewide assistance program that incorporates and understands that billing assistance is part of the solution, but not the total solution for energy burden, and also acknowledges that the state already has conservation requirements on utilities. So that whatever energy assistance program the state might offer is with respect to both reducing, or assisting with energy assistance, which really is a holistic billing assistance, conservation, sort of wraparound type program, right? Because we've already got the requirements on both, and so why wouldn't the pitched idea sort of incorporate that, I guess, is the thought. Or help utility programs that are already working to that end be as successful as they can be and increase their progress.
Yeah, thanks for those ideas, Jeff.
Yeah, appreciate the feedback there, Jeff. All right, I'm going to take a quick look at the chat. I think these are all good comments for us to consider, Glenn, but I don't see anything here right off the top of that we should pick up right now. Kind of closing up on our time to move to the next topic, so. Oops, sorry, folks. All right, let's move on then. So our next area for discussion here, we're going to take a quick look before we turn to thinking about the different funding sources for a statewide program to kind of look at the landscape of assistance need in the state, and see how that, take that into account before we start looking at funding sources, and to help us inform that discussion. So our report that we published back in March used the Department of Energy Low-Income Energy Low-Income Energy Assistance tool, the LEAD tool, Energy Affordability Tool. Sorry, I got my acronym wrong there. And that we use that tool and the information provided by utilities. And we took a look, and we had some key findings around costs. So more than 250,000 of low-income households in the state, about 25%, are energy burdened. That means their household residential energy costs exceed 6% of their household income. On average, that excess amount was $844 for these households. The total burden statewide was $234 million. These numbers do not include households who spend less than 6% of their household income, but who may still struggle to pay their bills. So this is, again, kind of going to Glenn's earlier point in the discussion we had about the costs above that amount. So as I mentioned, the data from this comes from the Low-Income Energy Affordability data tool, the LEAD tool. I think this group here has had a pretty extensive discussion of the LEAD tool and where the strengths and limitations of that tool. And that's summarized in Appendix D of our report. Encourage folks to go take a look at that if they have additional questions. Please send them to me. This tool is the best available tool that we have to look at this data. I don't know, Glenn, do you have anything else to add here?
I think just that, this data set is one that we've used to try to come up with an overall estimate of the size of the energy burden for low-income households in the state. It is not a source for information about individual households. A statewide program wouldn't start with numbers in the LEAD data set and come up with a program from that. A program would have to be based on actual information about actual households, and using whichever framework we might end up with, such as the ones that we just walked our way through, to come up with which households are eligible, what's the benefit that they would receive based on how much they pay for their energy services or not. It's just I want to make clear that the Department of Energy data is used to come up with that estimate of the overall amount, and geographically specific amounts, but it doesn't provide the information that we would need for an actual statewide program.
Thank you, Glenn. So from that tool, we were able to look at energy burden across counties in the state. And what you'll see here on the left hand of this chart is the average burden per low-income household from 0 to a little over 1,200. On the bottom, you have the percent of low-income households burdened from 0 to about 70%. The size of the dots on the chart represent the total excess burden in that county, and the color of the dots represent whether the county is rural or urban, as defined by the Office of Financial Management here in Washington State. So what you see, or what I at least see when I look at this chart here, is that we've got kind of a skew with rural counties having a large percent of low-income households being energy burdened in the state. Those average burdens per low-income household tend to be a little bit higher, if not significantly higher than some of the urban counties. But you can see that here if you wanted to look, we'll take a look later at a few of these in a table form. So if you can see here, you've got San Juan, Okanagan, Ferry, Columbia, Jefferson way up here. All of these dots being rural. As you move left, there's fewer percent of low-income households burdened in urban counties, but you do see larger dots for like King County and Snohomish, Clark, Pierce, Spokane, which also may not be too surprising given that those are the large population centers. So you'd have a larger, you'd expect a larger total excess burden there. So if you take a look from rural and urban counties in the state, what you see here is that the rural counties or households in rural counties are disproportionately energy burdened. There's more burden units in urban areas. There's a higher total excess burden. The average burden per household is about $46 more in urban areas, but the percent of household burdened is much larger in rural counties at 37% compared to 21% of households in urban counties. So what I did, and this is discussed at length in our report, is this concept of the rural utility dilemma. And I've selected 3 counties here that are rural and 3 of them that are urban. There's a lot more that you can take a look at in the report. But again, for the purposes of fitting something on a slide deck, I selected 3 here. Ferry and Okanagan are kind of at the top of the energy burden columns in terms of nearly all of these different measures. Jefferson is the highest on average energy burden per household, but kind of middle of the pack for these other metrics. And then Clark, King, and Snohomish are below middle, near the bottom of these different metrics, except for the total excess burden, which lines up, of course, with the chart that we were just looking at, because it's the same data set. So one of the ideas in the report, and that comes from looking at this data, is that rural counties here have a higher percentage of low-income households that are energy burdened. They tend to have a greater portion of the total population be low income and energy burden. So you can see that here, Ferry County's at 33%, 29% for Okanagan, 18% for Jefferson, compared to the urban counties where the numbers are much less at 7% across all 3 of these here. Average energy burden per household is a little bit of a mixed story, but they are higher here for these rural counties that we are looking at compared to the urban counties. 961 for Ferry, 991 for Okanagan, close to 1,200 for Jefferson, And then if you look at Clark, 665, King, 910, it's almost 793. And then if you look at total excess energy burden, the numbers are smaller for rural counties than in urban counties. But if you think about having to pay for assistance to help these low-income households, there's a smaller rate base in these rural areas, counties that have a greater percentage of low income. And so they're going to be needing to raise revenue from a rate base that is already disproportionately low income and energy burdened, which could push more people into that category significantly than if you were in a county where you have a greater percentage of households that are not low income and energy burdened. You have a much larger rate base to pull revenue from and to decrease overall costs. So less of those costs would fall upon low income households. I don't know, Glenn, did I wander off there or say anything?
I'm not sure I'm a good judge of that because, you know, I've been looking at that data for several years now, and I may, even though it seems clear to me, it may not, I may not be a good judge of whether it's actually clear.
Thanks, Glenn. You know, this question comes up in our report, and we are.
Hey, just before you do that, let me take a second and address Dan Fagerly's question about, you know, the energy data and how much we should rely on it. The source of this information it starts with census data, where they survey households and ask them questions about their income, how much they spend on, you know, different categories of goods and services, including energy. And it's a sample, you know, so it's not that everybody gets that questionnaire every month. So, you know, it's got some uncertainty in it due to the fact that it is a sample. It has some uncertainty in that, you know, people are reporting their own, you know, what they understand their income and their expenditures to be. They may not always get it right. But then the Department of Energy, in particular, because those energy expenditures, you know, well, how right are they? But so what the Department of Energy has done is some review and adjustment of the data to try to get it so that it does match up with actual energy expenditures that they collect through other sources the Energy Information Administration does. So it's not just that that the Department of Energy has taken everybody's survey result and, you know, not done any kind of reality check to it. There is some scrutiny that they've paid to that data before they publish it. Not that it's perfect, but I just want to convey that there is some effort that's been made by DOE to ensure that the results are somewhere in the ballpark of accurate at the, not at the individual household level, but at geographically appropriate levels, you know, things like county level data. All right, I'll let you keep going now, Austin.
All right. So the question arises is, how does the status quo funding mechanism, where we're looking at utilities, electric ones funding energy assistance or bill assistance to low-income households. What are the benefits, drawbacks, and other considerations we need to take into account there for delivery and to low-income households? An important benefit of this approach is that we avoid legislative appropriation, where every year the legislature makes budget decisions. It must reconcile competing needs in the state and make a funding decision for different programs. And this funding mechanism does not go through that process, so it's not subject to the uncertainty and funding levels that often come with requiring a legislative appropriation for a program. The drawbacks here that we've heard from stakeholders has been that this fragments a delivery of energy assistance to households served by two different utility providers. It can be hard to include, again, those non-utility energy costs. And it does not address the problem that was just laid out around funding rural utility programs and the disproportionate share of low-income energy burden households there. Finally, another consideration that we would need to take into account is that this funding mechanism does not achieve uniform benefits statewide, and that additional legislative requirements would be needed to do that and achieve those programs. And that is discussed in our report under the utility by utility approach discussion. But wondering if folks have other benefits, drawbacks, or other considerations to the status quo funding of bill assistance programs for low-income households. Nicholas.
Well, actually, I don't have that. I was hoping you could just explain a little further what you mean, because I just really don't understand by the other consideration, achieving uniform benefit levels statewide. Could you just explain that a little bit more? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think utilities across the state have offered different amounts of assistance, and so different funding amounts go towards that. And so the households at the end, when they're delivered a benefit, will receive different amounts of assistance across different utilities. And it can be very, very, very widely. At one point in the state, we had a program that was offering $1 a month of assistance compared to like a percentage discount, which would have much greater benefit. I think also we have there's also amount of access to programs, et cetera, that come with that.
But if I might, to be clear, the tiered percentage discount program or the monthly percentage program, they would also not be uniform benefits. They'd be, you're trying to achieve a uniform result. And I just want to make sure that the nomenclature is clear. What I think you're saying is that they wouldn't achieve the same level of final level of status for the recipients.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And we do use that term throughout the slide deck, so it'll come up again, but that's what we mean.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
a good point.
Thank you.
Appreciate that, Nicholas. Steve.
I think on the benefit side, and this is more applicable to COUs rather than IOUs, who have to go through the rate case process with the UTC. But on the benefit side, the status quo does allow utilities to tailor programs that meet the customer needs in their own service areas, and to also work closely with other service providers, just thinking about our CAP agencies, to maybe fill the gaps where LIHEAP and other broader based funded programs are not cutting it. So I think that is a benefit of status quo.
Thanks, Steve.
That ability to tailor programs. I get it, Steve. Tailor.
Oh, you know it. You know it.
I think we got some comments in the chat that I'll take a look at. Lori.
Hi, I'm a commissioner in Benton County, and something that I have often wondered is if we could get a clear signal from the state on what we're allowed to do for customer assistance. If I can give you an example, we spend, I believe, about 1% of our revenues we spend on a bill assistance program for like low-income senior citizens, veterans, disabled, that are income qualified. And when, I've wanted to increase that before, but the way we go about it is we do a comparison to all other PUDs. We try to be around the 80 percentile where we're not the top, but we can justify what we're doing because, we're not allowed to gift money to the public. So we're always kind of dancing this fine line. We're the regulator, but we always have to be careful that we're spending the public money in a way that the auditor won't look sideways at, that we're just giving money away. Even if you do have income qualifications, you can't all of a sudden just say 20% of the revenues that come in, we're going to give to low income. That would not be a reasonable thing to do. So if the state just sent us a clear signal, and I know you're not going to like this answer from me, but I think you should just back off and just send clear signals to the public utility districts. I can't speak to the IOUs, but send a clear signal saying, we would be okay with you spending this percent of your revenues on these programs to specifically help your energy burdened, and let's follow it and report back and see what we can do just with that. I mean, instead of just coming in and saying, give all your money to us and we'll take care of you. We all are so different. We are going to have a demand charge coming up. And so what I'd rather do is spend money on low income for things like heat pumps, for time of use devices on their water heaters, things like that, where someone else would be better off, like in Franklin County across the river, maybe they would be better off just with the flat kind of assistance that we have now and that they have now. So is there any way that you can actually get the results that you're looking for by backing off and telling the utilities what you would like to see, and then going back and looking to see the progress?
Lori, is there a specific statute that seems to be an obstacle in figuring that out?
Well, a lot of it is attorney opinion that you can't, like we have a REA that's near us, Benton REA, and they have scholarships. And I thought, well, why don't we have scholarships? Well, we can't do that. We can't gift public money. We're not an REA. We can't operate the same way. So when we do anything like this, we're always very cautious not to be outside of what everyone else is doing. So if everyone's in this same box, we're never going to be the leader of it. It's just really, you kind of feel like you can't really do the things that you want to do because of, you might say one thing, but the auditor is going to say another thing, or that you're spending money that you're not allowed to spend. If somebody comes in and says, my heat pump broke, I had to use strip resistance heat, my bill's 10 times more than I thought it would be, can you help me? We can't just help them like that. We have to do the regular things, like send them to CAC to get LIHEAP money. We do have a Helping Hands program where people donate money on their bill, but we don't even administrate that because we CAC administrates that. We want to be really careful, about how we administrate it. So why don't you just do that? Why don't you
Well-
just say, we're not gonna, you guys aren't gonna get in trouble if you spend up to, 3% of your revenues on low income.
We would be very happy to explore where the uncertainties are in the current statute. Because, to me, I'm concerned about an overly broad reading of the prohibition on gift of public funds. And in some cases, people may not be seeing the exceptions for low income customers that are provided there, and the express authority and statute for not just permitting utilities to address energy burden of low income customers, but actually directing them to do that. And so if there's more that needs to be done to clarify that in statute, we would be very happy to be a partner in that effort.
Well, I think if you first permit, and then if you just make it clear that you're permitted to address energy burden, maybe up to a certain point, then I think you'd get a lot of movements from a lot of utilities.
I like the sound of that.
I do too.
and
I think you should have a PUD resource board with your group, so anyway. I'll let someone else speak now. I see Michael has something there.
Okay.
All right, I think Kelly had a question next.
Hi, thanks, Austin. Kelly Hawk with Big Bend Electric Cooperative. More of a comment, really, kind of along Lori's lines also, with the frustration some of our utility groups have. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but for our utility, it's frustrating in the fact that CETA was enacted in 2019. According to the law, we were required to have programs available to assist low-income households by July 31st of 21. But data was collected specifically for the years of 2019 and 2020, prior to the required start date. So it's frustrating because I don't feel like we've had a chance to prove ourselves yet. We started several programs here with Big Bend. We've really tried to, increase our support of the community and low-income households. And I felt like the data that was collected, which was for 2019 and 2020, again, prior to the date when those programs came into play, is what was displayed to the legislature. So I can see where it appears to me they read the report, saw that rural utilities obviously are not making any progress whatsoever. So let's start a statewide system. And I feel like that it was misrepresented that basically we're not doing anything. And I just want our systems to have a chance, because I feel like we're making headway. Is it huge, drastic headway? No, but I see the data every day. I see the people applying for our new programs. We're giving out low-income weatherization assistance that we never did before. We are making improvements, and I just feel like that should be represented.
Well, thanks, Kelly, for your comment. I think I'd be happy to have a discussion about the report at a different time and not take too much of our time here. I would say that we will, that the report, if folks have this, come away from the report with the feeling that rural utilities aren't doing anything, I feel like they have gotten the wrong, message of the report. The report paints a rather complicated picture of the situation, has folks and their efforts summarized. We went extensively with, most folks said this is what we're going to be doing when they didn't have programs in place. in their reports. We followed up a number of times to get all that accurate and get that in place. And we'll have another reporting period coming up. So we're going to be working on that reporting template and get that data for folks. And all right. I think, Glenn, unless there's something urgent in the chat that we need to have, it looks like folks are just talking about gift of public funds and that sort of thing, bouncing ideas, which is good. We'll take Lori's question and then we'll go to a break before we get into the next section.
I'm just wondering, my email is listed on when I signed up. I'm wondering if Glenn can get back to me on where we could use the clarification. Okay.
Sure, I'd be happy
What
to.
Commerce can do. Thank you, Glenn.
Yeah.
Thanks,
That was an
Lori.
easy question.
All right, well, let's take a 10-minute break. So my clock here says it's 2:27. So I'm actually going to short us a few minutes. Let's come back at 2:35 and I'll see you all then and we'll continue along. Thanks all. All right. Got one more minute before our break's over. So we are running a tad bit behind on our schedule, so I'm going to move rather quickly through this section, and you'll have the slides posted on our energy assistance webpage, and then we have a comment period after this where you can provide your comments to the prompts that we're going to be looking at here. And I believe that save some conversation closer to the end on some of these additional mechanisms and save this context for further review for folks. So one of the topics that's come up from stakeholders is revenues from the Climate Commitment Act, our comprehensive cap and invest program that the legislature passed in 2021. This program sets a declining cap on carbon emissions statewide. Carbon producers bid on allowances to emit carbon under the cap, and those revenues go into the state general fund. There are a few exceptions for different types of allowances that I think this group will be fairly familiar with. The electric utility consigned allowances and the no-cost allowances provided for natural gas utilities. So we're going to talk about those real quick, just so that we're all on the same page as what's in the CCA and what the legislature has required for these different elements. So for the consigned allowances for the electric utilities, the legislature gave these to the utilities are consigned to auction, and the revenues or the proceeds from that are used to mitigate the cost burden of programs on electricity customers. The legislature further stated that the benefits of all the allowances must be used for the benefit of ratepayers, with the phrase here, with first priority on the mitigation of any rate impacts to low-income customers. So for the natural gas utility allowances, there's a similar provision, but for these no-cost allowances for natural gas utilities, the revenues from these allowances must be returned through non-volumetric credits on ratepayer utility bills, prioritizing low-income customers for energy assistance purposes broadly, including bill assistance. This must be in addition to any other requirements on natural gas utilities to deliver assistance to those customers. So the common theme of the next few questions are how would the use of a particular funding mechanism, in this case, the consigned allowances and no-cost allowances, impact the ability to deliver services to low-income households statewide? Again, this is kind of like our flat bill amount where we're kind of putting this out there to kind of start the exercise. And because we're running short on time, we're going to kind of cut that exercise and have folks submit comments on this particular topic. But again, we see this as avoiding annual legislative appropriation. Under the current model, funding is the drawback is that utilities are to be using this funding already to cover the costs of the Climate Commitment Act for the customers. These revenues right now are rather large. In the last few auctions have been above what Ecology expected in terms of revenues. However, I think there are fair questions about the medium to long-term reliability of high funding levels through the CCA, then other considerations around how allowances may not match the service area need for utilities. Thinking about, for instance, the ability of these allowances in a rural county served by a rural PUD to be used to provide enough assistance to households to be a reliable source of funding and a reliable program for those households. Any other quick questions about this particular mechanism? I think Sean raised his hand. Sean?
Thanks, Austin. Sean Bond for Liberty Utilities. I guess I'm struggling to understand the tie of even the discussion around consigned allowances and the conversation we're having related to CETA and energy assistance. As we know, electric utilities don't have to consign allowances. Speaking for ourselves, Avista doesn't intend to consign allowances. We need to use them for compliance. On the gas side, we do have to consign allowances, but those are intended to offset the burden of the CCA, not customers' general energy burden with paying their energy bills. And so I think where Dan is going in the comment, I guess I'm surprised that we're even bringing up consigned allowances. I don't know if we're going to get to, you know, the invest portion of the cap and invest and what the state's going to do with those funds, because it is pretty significant in terms of what the revenues are bringing in. But I'm just not connecting the dots between consigned allowances here.
Yeah, thanks, Sean, for your comment. I think this is in providing important, I think, important background context for what all the different pieces are in the CCA, and recognizing that the CCA discusses in it, particular to these consigned allowances, a prioritization of low-income households, and that is maybe a difficult thing to align with the need to offset costs for all ratepayers. I don't know, Glenn, if there's anything else that you want to add.
We're trying to be complete, and we've heard the suggestion, so we're working our way through it here. This is not an endorsement of this particular approach by any means.
Thanks, Glenn. Nicholas.
So just following up on the previous comment, I'm aware of several utilities, public utilities that foresee having to use the allowances they're getting to deal with above contract high water mark needs as their loads grow due to electrification, transportation, and buildings, and just general load growth. So I think that there's going to be a real hesitancy amongst utilities to basically release these allowances and put them for auction rather than hold them to deal with future needs. So I do think that this is being presumptuous, if you will, about what utilities would do with these allowances. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicholas. Appreciate your comments. And I think we'll hold any further comments on this to either go in the chat or move or in the comment survey that we posted for folks. So we're going to move along, I think, but wanted to recognize that this part of the CCA. So some other parts of the CCA. The CCA creates a number of accounts within the state general fund. There's a carbon emissions reduction account that's for transportation related greenhouse gas reductions. And then there's two other accounts, a natural climate solutions account and a climate commitment account. So under the carbon emission reduction account, there is through 2037 a, for lack of a better term, right of first deposit into that account from all revenues generated through the CCA. So in 2023, it's a relatively small amount of 123 million, and then it fluctuates around 360 million for the period 2024 through 2037. Post 2037, 50% of all revenue auction, it goes in there, and then the other 50% goes into the climate investment account with these two sub accounts. So the the carbon emission reductions accounts got first dibs. In the climate investment account, the remainder is divvied up between the natural climate solutions account, and 75% of it goes to the climate commitment account. One other stipulation here is in the climate commitment account here. The money can only be spent after it's been appropriated, so it's subject to that state general fund appropriation cycle. In that account, there are 19 categories of different types of programs, projects, and activities that the funds can go towards. One of those categories includes bill assistance in there. Other examples of different programs or categories include the working family tax credit, energy efficiency programs, development of renewable energy, a whole host of things that any funding from or appropriation from this account would have to compete with. And I want to stress that, again, this is funding that is not the whole amount of revenue. It is the remainder after allocations have been put into the carbon emissions reduction account, and it's 75% of all funds that go into the climate commitment account. Again, for the purposes of capturing everything in the Climate Commitment Act, there is a section 47 of that law, and the legislature here directs or states that its intent to establish policies that will mitigate the cost burden of the CCA for homes using heating oils and not electricity or natural gas. It instructs the Department of Ecology, in collaboration with stakeholders, to develop a proposal for assisting households with residential home heating. And the priority must be for low-income households through weatherization, conservation efficiency, and bill assistance. And in our report, which had us look at a system benefits charge and other additional mechanism of assistance, we point to this section 47 as being a possible statement of intent for appropriations out of the CCA to help with those non-utility energy fuels for households. And in looking at the system benefits charge, which would apply to electric or natural gas utilities, or could, what about those other sources or fuel sources? Who covers those costs? And we pointed to this particular part of the CCA for use of general fund dollars for those purposes. So focusing solely on the climate commitment account, which is that sub-account in the Climate Commitment Act in the state general fund, what would be some of the benefits, drawbacks, and other considerations? And these are a few of the things that came to mind for us as we thought about this. It's not all of these things as we've established in our other discussions. So this funding source could achieve a uniform benefit level across the state. It could avoid the utility rate base. So instead of having a under the status quo where utilities are charging customers to fund these programs, this does not charge utility customers directly. It is based on the revenues from the Climate Commitment Act. And then we noted the potential to supplement other funding sources in line with kind of the report and how we were discussing using the CCA as a supplemental to other revenues. A drawback here is it does involve that legislative appropriation, which can be a difficult thing to encounter year in and year out, and manage a reliable program for low-income households. Again, the medium to long-term funding reliability may be an issue. And then our other consideration is if these funds were going for the statewide program, you would have a reduced admin cost because you wouldn't have every utility standing up staff to support extensive low-income energy assistance programs. You'd have one program for the whole state. So you would reduce those costs statewide. So those are some of the ideas that we came up with and are looking for feedback from you all on this climate commitment account funding. Respect. I see a question about LIHEAP funds from Sean. LIHEAP is the federal program for low-income energy assistance. It's administered by the Department of Commerce, and we receive an appropriation for that particular program. And conversations, folks have brought up the observation that we should prioritize using the LIHEAP funds, or at least make sure that we use all the LIHEAP funds we receive, because they're essentially free money from the federal government. And I think moving that funding outside of the LIHEAP program is not possible, but there's ways to structure, I think, LIHEAP and the statewide program to make sure that we use all of the LIHEAP funds and are making sure that we're not leaving that money on the table. Ryan.
Thanks, Austin. Thanks, Glenn. I would say from Snohomish's perspective of the revenue raising options, we would certainly prefer the Climate Commitment Act dollars to be kind of the way of doing this. The account itself, particularly as we're kind of looking at both trying to fund bill assistance, but also energy efficiency programs as well. This gives a lot more leeway for those types of programs to be funded. And again, given the sizable amount the state has been pulling in, this seems like a very perfect fit.
Thanks, Ryan. Steve.
Yeah, I'd echo what Ryan said. I mean, right now, as we're seeing these, significant surpluses from maybe some overcollection of what was expected for the first few auctions, it seems that there's a good source maybe to start from. But whether it's CCA funded or from the general fund, I just think again, going back to most utility programs in the state are really kind of set up to supplement from energy assistance and not to have utilities be a social service program. I mean, I think that responsibility really belongs to the state or the federal government. And so whether it's this type of program is funded through general fund sources or through specific revenues from CCA auction proceeds, that would be preferable to charges for utility customers that are basically being redistributed across the state. So sorry to have the don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the guy behind the tree. But I mean, I think there is a principle involved in this, in that again, our job as electric utilities is to provide reliable, cost-effective service to customers. It's not to be a social service program. That is really the purview of the state and the nonprofits that get their support from public funding.
Thanks, Steve, for your comments. And thanks, folks, for the comments in the chat. I would, caution us to think of, for the same reasons that we discussed earlier, conflating this particular work with CETA. There's obviously this legislative direction that comes from CETA for the energy assistance requirements that utilities currently have. I think we're trying to think of this program as being broader than what is in the Clean Energy Transformation Act. So I'm trying to address some of the misalignment there. Sean.
Briefly, I'm all for using the CCA revenues. I think it's a great funding source for a statewide program if we go that route. There could be a couple potential considerations. I don't know if I call them drawbacks, but considerations to think about. If Washington links with Quebec and California, I think we see allowance prices could go down drastically. That could mean a reduction in revenues for the state. So that might get to the medium to long-term funding reliability. There may be a question there. Secondly, I think it's a fair assumption to talk about where probably most of the allowances are being purchased to be used for in the transportation sector, and natural gas utilities obviously have a significant need for allowances. And so those costs are likely being passed back to the consumers already. And so low-income customers are shielded from those costs of the CCA. And so there's a potential cost impact as we're just shifting who's paying for these programs. It could be on top of what customers are already paying for. So it could be, we're going to pay either way, I guess is the point. It's just whether you pay through utility rate, you pay at the gas pump, we're all paying in some fashion.
Thanks, Sean, for your comments. I am, without seeing the most recent comment, I'm going to move us along just because of, for the sake of time. But I appreciate this. There's a set of comments, a question in our comments to look at these pieces. Please take a look. And I think, again, as our Assistant Director, Michael Furs, discussed, thinking about those impacts to low-income households from choosing these different funding sources on, and the impacts on a particular design. I think, Sean's comment there around, potential linkage and its effect and the reliability here is one of those key areas. All right, so once we get the slide deck moving, I am actually going to transition it over now to Glenn to run our discussion here for the State General Fund.
Thank you. And following up on the concept of the Climate Commitment Act Investment Fund, this one is maybe the broadest possible option, and that is the State General Fund. I think most of you are familiar with the way our budget process works. It's a 2-year biennial budget that the legislature appropriates. And then in the second year, there's a supplemental budget where they will true things up. But that's the basic process as it goes through the legislature every other year. It's negotiated and debated, signed by the governor, and then implemented over that period. And the general fund is general. It's used to fund all kinds of things across the state, many different programs, both direct benefit programs and also, infrastructure programs, and whether it's community development, services to different people in need in different ways. It's just a very broad, and there's always a lot of competition for the money. General fund. So let's look at our pluses and minuses on this. So using the general fund as the source for this, as with the Climate Commitment Act source, seems like we would be able to achieve a uniform set of benefits for eligible participants this way, since the money would be coming from the state. The state could, set the structure of the benefits so that it achieves a statewide result that doesn't vary from one county or utility area. And it avoids the burden on utility rates as the source. And it's not just that that there is a burden, but that under the status quo, that burden could vary quite a bit from one utility to another. You don't have that situation if you use the state general fund. And it's a potential there for it to serve in a supplement function instead, even though we tend to think of this as being a full replacement for existing energy bill assistance programs, it wouldn't necessarily have to be that way. It could be used as a supplement in one way or another. In terms of the drawbacks, it is subject to negotiation and decision by the legislature every 2 years. The general fund of the state, can vary quite a bit from year to year, especially in terms of how much growth you get in revenue. There are good years and there are bad years. And since the general fund is used so broadly, it does seem like a drawback that energy bill assistance programs would have to compete with other very worthy uses of state general funds, including other uses that are intended to benefit the same people and households that the energy bill assistance would be designed to provide for. So it could be competing with housing programs and child care programs, things like that would, the energy assistance could be at risk due to that competition and the choices that the legislature would end up making. And then in terms of other considerations, it does seem like this is a mechanism that in terms of raising the money, it has very low administrative costs for doing that. We have, existing mechanisms for collecting a variety of different taxes that contribute to the state general fund. Wouldn't have to be any new tax or fee or anything like that if the money comes from the state general fund. So that is the overview there. I think that's probably pretty well understood by everybody already. And so with no hands up, maybe we could go ahead and talk about the system benefit charge. Or am I rushing things, Austin? Oh, Nicholas has his hand up. I was rushing things.
Not really, but I completely agree with all of these comments, but I would point out that the cyclical economic dynamics is echoed in utility revenues, whether it's because of changes in weather, and that results in different amounts of energy sold or wholesale power costs that utilities are buying. And so while I don't disagree with it, I think that this very point could be made for every revenue source that's based upon a percentage amount.
Okay, thanks, Nicholas.
Thanks, Nick. Okay. Let's move on to the next one. If we can get the slide deck working. System benefits charges. Glenn, you're on point for this one as well.
Okay, so The concept here is that in terms of a funding source for a statewide energy bill assistance program, it would be funded uniformly across energy services within the state. So it could be that all of the electric companies and the gas companies, maybe other companies too, would collect from their customers an amount of money. It might be as a percent of revenue. It might be an amount, per unit of energy, per kilowatt hour, per therm, or per BTU. And then that money would be used to fund the energy bill assistance program. The mechanics of it, we haven't gotten into a lot of detail on that, but in general, I think the concept would be that this money is paid into a fund that could be used only for this purpose. It would be a dedicated account within the state treasury, and then the money flows back out to individual utilities based on the energy assistance that they provide under one of those different frameworks that we discussed earlier in the meeting, or some variation on one of those. And it would show up on the bills of the customers. This is a concept that is reflected in the CETA bill itself in terms of things that Commerce is supposed to study. So we continue to study it. There are examples of from other states. The Oregon Energy Assistance Program, for example, is based on a system benefit charge approach. What we're thinking of here is that it would fund this ongoing bill assistance for low-income customers. So it would be additional to and not really intended to replace short-term crisis funding that is available through LIHEAP. I see Mindy has her hand up, so maybe I should go ahead and take your question or comment, Mindy.
Mindy, if you're talking, you're on mute. Oh.
And okay, in the meantime, I think Christina Wyatt, that's a good analogy that she's offered in the chat, that it would be sort of like the 911 fee that shows up on telephone bills. It goes then to fund, county and state 911 services. So I think that's a good analogy to a system benefit charge on energy services. So let's go on to the next slide, Austin. So benefits and drawbacks. Again, since it's a state fund, the state program would be able to define the benefits and assure uniformity. It would allow us to address what we've called earlier the utility dilemma, the rural utility dilemma, where at some point it becomes increasingly challenging for utilities that have a lot of low income, high burden customers to pay for that within their own system. So, it allows for the spreading of costs across the state. Because it's a dedicated account, there's no legislative appropriation required. And so the funding, one presumably would be more reliable and predictable. One drawback in it that I hinted at when I was describing it was, whether you would be able to go beyond natural gas and electricity in terms of assessing this charge, whether we'd be able to incorporate non-utility fuel sources, incorporate them both in terms of collecting revenue on those fuels, but then also providing benefits to the people who use those fuels. And some other considerations here. One is that in terms of the administrative cost, it seems like they would be higher than they are where you're using an existing revenue collection mechanism such as the Climate Commitment Act or the State General Fund. The administrative costs may not be too high. We'd have to think about that some more, but it seems like they would be higher than the last two mechanisms that we mentioned. And then another consideration that we put here, because we've heard it from some of the utilities, is that when you would look at the spreadsheet, you would see that for some utilities, the amount of money that's collected from those customers is more than the amount of money that's provided to the customers of that utility. You'd see that utilities that tend to have, say, 7% of their customers who have energy burden there'd be a net flow of money from those to the ones that have 15% or 28% or 34% of their customers having low-income energy burden. And at least for some utilities, that is consideration or maybe even a drawback to this mechanism. It's one that I think we should acknowledge, and I think it's an inherent element of this. Essentially, it's intended to provide that transfer because that's how it spreads the costs between the high cost and low cost, the high income and the low income areas of the state. So that is the recap on the system benefits charge, and your comments and questions are welcome. On Thor's question about whether we've evaluated the legality of it, we have not. This is something that the legislature would be enacting. We certainly don't have the authority to do it today, so the legality of us doing it without legislative action pretty clearly is we don't have that authority. But whether the legislature could enact a law that does that is something that we haven't looked into. Steve Taylor.
Yeah, I think I missed how it would be applied. Would it be applied as a flat charge on utility bills, or would it be graduated? And again, just thinking about with how regressive versus progressive would this be as a funding source? And I guess as I get back to the general fund purpose for the state, even though we do have somewhat of a regressive tax system in Washington State versus others, it just still would seem that, especially if you're looking to benefit low-income customers, obtaining that revenue from in a more progressive way would be fairer than applying flat charges.
Yep, right. Are there any utility programs? Anybody from a utility, or if you're not from a utility but you're familiar with the funding mechanisms that some of the utilities use today to, provide money for low-income assistance programs, whether it's bill assistance or energy conservation. If you got anything to share about how your utility, sets a rate on a percentage basis or per kilowatt hour basis to generate money to be used to provide benefits to low-income customers within your own utility base. It'd be great to hear from others on that. If we have time for that, Austin.
We have time.
All right, let's just see if anybody wants to talk about how their own utility does it. Steve.
Sorry to use up the space in the airspace here. I mean, I would say, again, primarily for COUs, and probably the same way for IOUs too. It's a cost. I know there are some utilities that do have separate charges that, and we're hearing more of this, in kind of a post-CETA world. But yeah, it's just part of our expenses that goes into the overall rates, and so rates will be impacted as that, more money is appropriated from rate revenue, let's say on the residential pot for that rate design, and the higher that number goes, the greater the impact on rates, which means either higher rate increases or lower rate decreases, but it's somewhat of a zero-sum game there. But anyway, for our specific utility, we do not have specific charge that's on a bill for low income. It just comes out of our general rate design.
Yeah, but I think there are some, like I'm a PFC customer. I believe on my bill there's a low income charge that's collected as a separate line item that I think is per kilowatt hour rather than a percentage. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, the reason I was inviting that sort of conversation is because I think of that as being like a system benefit charge, except that it's just within the system of that one utility. And now I see a couple more hands up. So Lisa, let's see what you have.
So similar to Steve, we do ours through the budget process. So we have a couple programs of senior citizen credit that we do that's funded through our budgeting process. So it would be, as Steve mentioned, in the rates already. We also have a guarantee of service program that there is a certain amount of funding available for customers that are having challenges with arrearages and paying their bills, their current bills as well. Also budgeted via the budget process every year. So indirectly, it is coming from ratepayers already, but it's in the budget. It's budgeted for, I should say. And then we also have a participation from our local community in our Operation Warm Heart program that is all donation-based, customer and employee donations. And we have, that's a great program. We also run a race for warmth to put funds in that as well. So yeah, those are the ways, that's how we kind of get our funds to distribute to our community.
Great, thank you. And Thor Peterson.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll probably just echo what was just said for the most part, but just in terms of defining where the funds are coming from for our utility discount program, that is foregone revenue. That's how we categorize it. So the discount, so basically that does then build itself back into our rate structure. It becomes part of our forecast models that do determine the next, rate rate determinations. And then secondarily for arrearage management, that category is considered debt forgiveness, essentially, writing off bad debt. So in both of those cases, it's, you know, it's dealt with within the sort of strictures and frameworks that we have for accounting purposes, if you will, at the utility. So I just think that's where it kind of runs a little bit differently from the idea of sort of, you know, identifying a per kilowatt hour, you know, charge that you'd levy across the whole, you know, the whole ratepayer base, but and becomes a little bit more embedded, kind of maybe doesn't quite have the transparency that a direct charge would.
Right. Thanks for sharing that.
I'd ask, for just for our purposes, I guess that's in the registration, never mind. I won't. Any other folks have any comments on this or their, the way they currently run their programs? Or fund them, I should say. All right, well, there is, as you know, a comment survey that you can fill out and discuss the benefits, drawbacks, and other considerations further, as well as how this would impact services for low-income households. So let's, oh, Lisa.
I had a quick question for you all. As I know, this is a process that we're going through to provide information based on a statewide program. Many of us are already investing significant resources and funds into meeting the CETA requirements. And, you know, we have things that are either going to come before our boards. I know we at Clark will have a process that's going to come before our boards, our board of directors coming up soon for the 2024 budget season to look at some of our funding in these programs to meet some of the CETA requirements. Do you have a timeline on, like, are we supposed to pause and wait for something to happen? Like, it's one of those things that whether we're investing resources to create programs or we're investing a good deal of resources to do the IS piece to make these programs function and work within our utility, it's a significant investment. So that, you know, I think we should be given at least a heads up if there's going to be like some magic pixie dust wand that gets thrown at all of this and we're going to all be able to meet our CETA requirements. But I don't want to have our utility spend our ratepayers' money on developing and trying to meet CETA guidelines if all of a sudden there's going to be some big umbrella that's going to, you know, save the day and, you know, whatever. I just want to make sure that I'm not that I'm not spending a bunch of money that I don't need to spend. So do you have a timeline, Austin?
So this study, we are working to put out our paper, mind you, in July of 2024, but the requirements on the books are the requirements on the books. I don't know, Glenn, do you have any other comment? I mean, I think when I listen to your comments, Lisa, too, I think about those significant costs that come to trying to meet those requirements, and I'm trying to help our households. It's a lot.
Yeah, I don't see anything in what the legislature has done so far that suggests anybody should pause in their efforts. This study is, I mean, it's just such a small step into you know, a range of possibilities. And there's so many more steps that would be required, even if there was complete agreement that what we really need is a statewide program instead of those utility ones. Seems to me like it'll take a long time and a lot of effort for that to come to pass, and that the utilities and the people who benefit from the utilities programs will have many opportunities along the way to be heard about the need to protect the investments that they've made. So I'm just sure that sponsors of this effort would not want it to be seen as a signal that utilities should slow down.
Thank you.
Nicholas.
So I guess I want to make sure that I appropriately understand the system benefits charge approach. When I was thinking about it, I was using the Energy Trust of Oregon as the guide, whereby the trust gets a certain amount of money from each customer and then spends it as they see fit to provide energy conservation assistance to customers. But my understanding is utilities are kind of cut out of that entire process. And that's kind of how I was thinking this would work if you decide to centralize the collection of money. Am I misunderstanding that? Because based upon the last few minutes, it sounds like a very viable approach would be to centralize the collection of money and then redistribute it to utilities to send out to their customers. And I'm just trying to understand if you have a administrative plan or thought process about how the money would be actually allocated to customers.
I mean, I think we think mostly about the system benefit charge as the source of funds. If we need X million dollars in order to provide energy bill assistance across the state to a certain level of energy burden, we could get the money. One way would be by assessing a unit charge on energy consumption and use that regardless of how we might administer the money. But it does, I think with any of these statewide funding mechanisms, it seems like you don't get very far without the help of the utilities, because the utilities better than anybody else know how much people are spending on their energy services, at least the energy services that they provide. So there are limits on that. They don't necessarily know, without help from others, who should be receiving the benefits. But it seems to me anyway that a statewide program would benefit greatly from having the utilities as partners in order to distribute whatever level of benefits and whatever structure you have on those benefits to the recipients, so that they end up paying a lower bill for their energy services.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that clarification. I would simply point out that the ability of utilities to provide that assistance in the way you described is going to vary greatly. Some utilities currently use cap agencies to help and kind of stay out of that process, other than simply to make sure that the actual amount is owed is made known to the cap agencies, and others have a full-blown program that they completely administer themselves. And I think that the challenge here, if you're going to use utilities, is simply trying to find a program that can accommodate both approaches. So I encourage you to think through the administrative challenges and try to help utilities apparently work with their existing structures rather than have to create new ones. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thor.
Hi, yeah, and I should have mentioned earlier, I'm with Seattle City Light. Sorry about not mentioning that, Austin. I should put it in my name. But what Lisa has mentioned, what Jeff just mentioned in the chat here, I do think that we really need to pay attention to how we've been sort of anatomizing the elements of this program design, and we need to think about how devilishly interdependent they are. That the funding source really can't be decoupled from the overall design, in my opinion, because, for example, with this systems benefits charge, I remember in our first public comment meeting, Hassan brought up that, you know, one way to make this more fair would be that utilities that had been investing heavily in supporting their income qualified customers should get some sort of credit back, or the charge would be reflective of that. And a per unit charge directly to our customers on the bill does not accommodate for that sort of flexibility, unless we're going to be refunding that customer for that charge at a later date, which sounds just like administratively circular and silly. So I'm just want to point out that, like, this particular funding mechanism has that pretty substantial limitation that otherwise we will see these unintended consequences, like utilities holding off on investing significantly because we're waiting to see what the program design is going to look like by the state, and whether because yeah, we don't want to overinvest in something that's going to be solved for us.
Thank you.
All right, if there are no other questions or comments, we will move on. So we're going to talk a little bit about next steps in our process once we get the slides going. So we have a comment period open on the topics we've discussed today. Those the comment form is posted on our CETA Energy Assistance webpage. The deadline for those comments is Friday, September 15th. That's roughly 4 weeks, which is longer than we've had at other comment deadlines. And we're doing that to accommodate for Labor Day and kids going back to school, that sort of thing. Our next workshop will be on Monday, September 25th. That workshop is going to focus on program administration and data. And the following comment deadline will be on October 13th. We will post the meeting notes from today, as well as the comments in the chat, in a consolidated document on our webpage, likely by the end of the week. Once we have time to do that, the recording will be posted as well. We will be posting our comments from the past workshop once we have all those and have those consolidated as well. So I don't have anything else. This is the list of folks here. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. I appreciate folks raising questions, and we'll reach out to you as well to help discuss those. And that's all I have, unless anyone has any further questions. All right, if not, thank you all and have a good rest of your week. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
We'll be looking forward to your comments. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.